So welcome to Project Lift Up. You're in great hands with both Kim and Victoria. So Dr. Kim Mitchell is a research professor at Psychology of Crimes Against Children Research Center, and it's located in New Hampshire. So welcome down from New Hampshire. Her areas of research include youth exposure to violence, generally with specific emphasis in areas of technology facilitated crimes against children. Who hasn't heard of that? So thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for doing that. She has over 200 articles published in peer-related reviews, and she's been cited over 33,000 times. She's probably been cited by me like 100 times in the last week. So that also goes true for Victoria Banyard, who happens to be here with us at Rutgers. And she's a distinguished professor at the School of Social Work at Rutgers, New Brunswick. She's trained as a clinical psychologist, and she's worked in areas of violence prevention and resilience after trauma for 3 decades. She's the author of the book Strength-Based Prevention and is known nationally and globally, especially for her research and program evaluation of bystander focus. So thank you, Kim. Thank you, Vicki, for joining us today. I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to mute myself, hand this over to you. But I do want to start with just how did you get started? How did you get started with this idea for Project Lift Up, or your idea of how did you get started in the work? So thank you.
Awesome. Great. Well, I'll kick us off and then I'll turn it over to Kim. And so thanks for that question and thanks for the opportunity to be here and to be working with all of you. So really, I got into this work through collaborations with practitioners. So which is where like all the best ideas start in those collaborations. And it was really more in the area of violence prevention. I was in New Hampshire and got a call from our statewide coalition saying we want to do more evaluation of this new thing that people are talking about, bystander intervention, which is a strengths-based approach to sexual assault and relationship violence prevention, where everybody has a role to play and a seat at the table. And I said, okay, why not? And started doing that work. And really where it came together with suicide prevention is, of course, whenever you're working in violence prevention, violence and trauma, it's so connected to mental health crises, to suicide. And of course, you know, we can't live in this world, any of us, without, even if we're not clinicians, though certainly I interacted with suicide thoughts and behaviors a lot when I was working as a clinical psychologist, working with children and adolescents and seeing how real the risk of suicide is. But also personally, you know, knowing friends who were coping with suicide loss in their family. And so this Project Lift Up has been this just amazing opportunity to kind of pull together a lot of different threads around strengths-based prevention and resilience and trauma, and getting to work with my amazing colleague Kim as well. So that's a little bit of my story.
And yeah, my story is a little different. My background's psychology, but not clinical psychology. I am a researcher. I love data. I love numbers. I love how it can help us and help you and help kids. So I'm really excited to be here to do that with you today. I started out more in the interpersonal child maltreatment violence field, and the more and more I did research, just realized just how much overlap there is, not only amongst all different types of violence exposure among kids, but also self-directed violence. So, I've known Vicki for a very long time. And Vicki brings the clinical background and the qualitative work. And we came up with this project to see, what else can we do to kind of move the field forward to help people who struggle with suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So kind of quickly how we got here.
Yeah. So Kim's going to get us started with the slides. We want to give
yeah.
a shout out to Deirdre Colburn, who's our colleague who also, Deirdre and Kim have our Project Lift Up colors and backgrounds. I didn't get tech savvy enough to put that up today, so you just get my office. But we'll give you the website at the end. And but these are the colors and the graphics that we try to have very upbeat related to our prevention work.
Great. So just confirming everybody can see our slides here?
Yes.
Great. Okay. All right. So this slide outlines the key questions that drive Project Lift Up, and they're all focused on how young people support each other in difficult moments. So first we ask, and this is the overall study, who actually helps their peers? And it's not just who wants to help, but who has the opportunity and who steps in when it counts. That's especially relevant in moments of crisis or loss where opportunities to support can be uneven. Second, we look at how helping changes over time. Youth learn from experience. So we're examining how earlier attempts to help or how others respond shape what they do in future situations. Third, we examine differences across groups. We know that access to support and trust and social positioning vary. So we're looking closely at how helping patterns differ across diverse youth, particularly by social and racial identity. And finally, we're asking what surveys miss. Through in-depth interviews, we're trying to understand what's going on through a young person's mind in real situations, especially when they're deciding whether to step in during something as serious as violence, loss, or trauma. And ultimately, this helps us better understand how to support youth in showing up for each other during some of their hardest moments. So I want to take a minute to orient you to exactly what Project Lift Up is. It's a longitudinal study, which means we're following the same young people over time rather than just taking a single snapshot. We began data collection in 2022 and recruited nearly 5,000 adolescents and young adults, which gives us a really powerful window into how these experiences unfold. And what you're seeing here is the timeline of data collection. We started with a baseline survey and then followed participants at multiple time points, 6, 12, 18, 24, and now actually we're just wrapping up data collection on our final 30-month survey. And at each of these time points, we're not just asking general questions. We're asking about specific incidents where young people were concerned about a peer's suicide risk or self-harm and what they did in response. So this design lets us do something really important. We can look at change over time. So for example, how does helping behavior evolve? What happens after a young person tries to help? Does it make them more or less likely to help again? And how do their own mental health and experiences shift alongside that? So instead of just asking, do young people help? We can ask, what happens after they try? And how does that shape what they do next? And that's really the core strength of this project. And importantly, this is a mixed method study. So in addition to the survey data collection, we also conducted in-depth interviews with both practitioners and young adults to better understand context and decision making. So we're combining large-scale patterns with real-world experiences. And we want to note that this is not a co-designed or participatory action research project with young people. We've done a number of those studies, and we recognize that that work is very important. And we do have some ideas for next steps using those models. But the mixed methods does allow us to hear youth voices. And also just to note that this study was based on a pilot study that we conducted to test and develop the measures we used here. And in that study, youth gave us some really important feedback, specifically around all the different ways they tried to help. So just again, to ground us a little bit more in the data, as I mentioned, this study includes nearly 5,000 adolescents and young adults. What's unique about this study is we're not just asking general questions. We have incident level data, and we asked at each 3 of the waves to participants could report up to 2 specific situations where they were concerned about someone. And that adds up to over 7,000 incidents across things like suicidal ideation, attempts, loss, and non-suicidal self-injury. So we're really able to look at what happens in real situations, not just overall attitudes. And this slide gives you a quick snapshot of who was in our study. Participants were ages 13 to 22 at baseline. They were geographically diverse. We actually have participants in all 50 states. About half lived in suburban communities, with the rest split pretty equally between rural and urban areas. And importantly, this is a very diverse sample in terms of identity. So about 37% identified as gender minority, 58% as sex minority. So as we move into the findings, keep in mind that we're looking at a large national and notable sexual and gender minority inclusive group of young people. And finally, before I hand it back over to Vicky, here's just a quick roadmap of what we're going to be talking to you about today. We're what we're learning about risk and protective factors for suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Vicky's going to start you off with that. Then I'm going to talk about early warning signs and intervention. Then we'll spend time on the role of peers, since that's really at the center of this project. And importantly, we'll focus on how to support young people who are trying to help their friends. And then we'll wrap it up with next steps and leave time for questions. Okay, on to you, Vicki.
Great. Thanks, Kim. And we'll pause after each theme. We did actually organize some of the themes for around the questions that you all submitted when you registered. So you'll see some of your questions embedded in there. But I think we have our first poll to get a sense of who's in the room. Just wondered what age group folks work with primarily. Just take a minute for that. Oh, we've got a good diversity of range of where people are working. Excellent. So hopefully you all can see your work reflected in this poll as well. See who's in the room. Excellent. So a lot of folks working with school age, elementary, middle school, high school, but also with undergraduates, young adults, and also some working with adults. And hopefully for every age group, you'll find some findings that will be relevant to your work. Right. Do we want to do the second poll now, Deirdre, or wait?
They all launched at the same time, so
Okay.
folks can answer them as we go, and then we can look at the results as we go. Yeah,
Great. And we'll do a pause and then do the results of the next one. Okay,
sounds
great.
good.
Thank you. All right. So the first theme that we have is about risk and protective factors. And again, just as a reminder that the main aims, as Kim talked about, are really about peers helping others in their social networks. But this is an NIMH funded study. We have the details of that at the end, with, of course, the disclaimer that none of these things that we are saying represent the NIMH. They are ourselves and our findings, but we do acknowledge them as our funder. And so as our funder, they do require that we have a number of mental health measures that are included as part of the survey. So we're able to look at some of the mental health also of our participants, in addition to how they are trying to help their peers. So we'll dive into this. The next slide shows some details about exposure. So the first thing, Kim talked about it as opportunity. We also talk about it as exposure, which is this idea of, do they know someone who they are worried about is struggling with non-suicidal self-injury, any suicide ideation, or any suicide attempt. And we have the graphic here that talks about this. So we had almost 81% said that they had known someone at some point that they were worried were struggling with non-suicidal self-injury. 86% someone they were worried about because of suicide ideation, and 82% any suicide attempt. So this is a group of young people who are aware of and worried about others in their social networks. And so we're finding that lots of young people are having opportunity potentially to be helping their peers. And that fits with some of the research we know about peers being the first that if someone is in distress, they are most likely to go to their peers first. So, when we say, how are youth involved in suicide prevention? I mean, the reality is, right, they already are on a daily basis. So one of the things that we are able to look at, and that we're finding that I think is something that we haven't really looked enough at in terms of peers helping peers, is this idea of bystander burden. And what we find is the more exposure that young people in our survey, who are participants in our survey, reported, that was linked to higher symptoms of their own depression and anxiety that they were reporting, as well as higher levels of their own self-reports of suicide thoughts and behaviors. So so being exposed and incidence of exposure does carry with it a cost. That we also know that young people who are aware of more peers, right? So exposure can be through different types, but it can also be just, we ask them, how many people were you worried about in this category of incident, right? And the more people they knew, then the more, as well as the more complex problems that those peers were grappling with. And what we mean by that is, we called it sort of co-occurring concerns. You all see this, I'm sure, all the time in your work, where they're worried about someone because they may have suicide thoughts or maybe engaging in some form of self-harm behaviors, but they also know that other stuff is going on. Like there might be risky substance use, there may be academic stress, there may be family concerns or problems, and peers are aware of this. And when you put together knowing more people who you're exposed to, who you're worried about, and knowing about more problems that those people are dealing with, then that is also linked to the bystander or the participant expressing more distress. So that complexity of what peers are dealing with also weighs heavy on their peers who are trying to help. So another important piece is that peers are rarely helping in just one situation. Kim and I have studied bystander intervention across a number of different types of prevention, right? So I started this work studying sexual assault, sexual harassment, and dating violence. And that, we also know that there are bystanders to bullying. And there are also, as we're studying about in Project Lift Up, bystanders to suicide thoughts and behaviors. And so oftentimes, in addition to being worried that someone has lots of different problems that they're working with and the peers trying to help them with, we also know that separately, young people talk about, oh yeah, I know a friend who's coping with dating violence. And over here, I know someone who was experiencing sexual assault. And then someone over here I'm worried about because of mental health concerns. And so they're often trying to help across multiple issues. So helping really isn't a single moment. It's an ongoing role, and it's oftentimes ongoing multiple roles that young people are in. And I think this has implications for prevention, and we'll talk more about this in a bit. But we still largely do prevention in silos. So for a long time, I was doing bystander prevention evaluation and program design and what have you around sexual assault. And that was the thing. Like that's really where a lot of bystander intervention got started. And we were just talking about sexual assault. And then, well, maybe we brought sexual harassment in, right? And then it was, oh, this big deal when we started also talking about relationship violence. Well, what this data in Project Lift Up is telling us is it's all the things. And it's all the things all the time. And so having these separate silos of prevention may not really be meeting young people where their life experience is. And that we really need to be working across these issues so that we're tying bullying prevention in with sexual harassment prevention and relationship violence prevention and suicide prevention, and figuring out all the ways that those can interconnect. And I talk a little bit about that in the next slide, which are some key takeaways for practice, which we're going to try to integrate throughout our presentation. And really the big takeaways: helping carries costs, and we need to appreciate those. And so I think that also means that we need to be assessing the helping roles. So we need to go, and we need to go beyond asking youth about their own suicide thoughts and behaviors to also asking about anyone they may be worried about. And then not just asking, are they worried about someone, but asking them, how is that helping going? Because I think that can be really important. And then I'll talk a little bit about the interviews. We're still in the midst of coding and interpreting. It's very rich data, so it takes a while. But I think this really fits with what we're hearing from our practitioner interviews, where they really talk about, we had 26 practitioners who talked about the need for young people to recognize early risk and warning signs and to continue our work in that area. young adults who we interviewed 25 of them, also talk about recognizing a range of early signs like changes in behavior or withdrawal, seeing signs of depression and stress, a person directly saying they were at risk for self-harm. And here's a quote from one of these young adults. The most recent time I was actively a part of was probably in middle school. And one of my friends, it just seemed off, is the best way I can put it. Like things weren't quite right. Some of the self-deprecating humor was a little extra over the top, right? So they're talking about these early indications and worry and trying to figure out what they might do about that. Practitioners, on the other hand, talked about how we can have challenges where young people might be joking around about using suicide in a joking way, in an unhealthy way, and they talk about how that sort of normalizes terms like suicide and can make it really difficult for young people to distinguish when is this somebody joking around and when is this like a joking around that might be actually indicating something more serious. And then the other piece around risk factors is talking about protective factors. So a really huge part of my research for the past 30 years has been seeing strengths and seeing strengths as something not just a low level of risk, right? And I wonder, Deirdre, if we want to put the question in the chat for our participants. We have a question for you. Which is, and you can maybe put your answer in the chat and we can spend just a minute for you to be looking at what you all see as your superpower or secret sauce for the work that you do. So what is a strength that keeps you in this work, or a strength that brings you into this work, a main strength you lean into doing the work, how it helps you cope, right? Use the chat. Let's see. Faith, connection to colleagues, interpersonal connection, absolutely. Collaboration, compassion, environment, interpersonal, purpose, passion, absolutely. Yep, lots of different things. Empathy, desire to support children, connection and hope, caring and empathy, reminding myself we are just trying to figure out life together. Yes, faith, community involvement, love, hope and belief in people creating change in their lives. Excellent. Thank you. Well, you all have just basically done this slide for me because this is our model, the strengths model that I've been working on and developing with colleagues in the field. We call it the resilience portfolio model because the idea is that there's no one thing, that resilience really is a process of achieving well-being and purpose and all kinds of positive outcomes in spite of adversity, in spite of the difficulties of the work, in spite of our own challenges that we experience. And in the resilience portfolio model, we have 4 different domains. We have regulatory, like emotion regulation, self-compassion. Many of you talked about that. Interpersonal connection, support, mentoring, meaning-making strengths, a sense of purpose and hope, right? Activism in the work. Many of you find purpose in your work. It's what inspires me about working with all of you. An environmental domain, including positive and healthy built environment and natural spaces. And so we really want to be looking at how these strengths, it's not just one thing, it looks different for every person, but that these things can also help the helpers and help their mental health and that they are also using strengths in their helping. And so in Project Lift Up, one of the things that I think is really innovative is that we tried to measure all of these things. And so in the blue boxes, you see a lot of those examples of the kinds of things that we measured. And so what we found is that we identified patterns and groups of strengths. So we were able to do actually some statistics that helped create portfolios and looked at different combinations of strengths that different subgroups of our participants had, and looked at it in relation to, in this case, lower levels of depression and anxiety, lower levels of suicide thoughts and behaviors, and really finding that there are some really distinct groups, and that some of them may have all kinds of risk factors and also at the same time all kinds of strengths. And those are the folks, we call them our resilient activists, because those are the folks that are doing just amazing amounts of helping. So we can talk about some of the specific strengths we were also able to look at that are related to the well-being of our participants. Mentoring, having a mentor, having hope, self-compassion, being able to positively regulate your emotions, being involved in activism and having purpose in life, though those were particularly important for gender diverse and youth across different sexual identities, that there were also some differences by subcommunity in which kinds of strengths really helped to buoy their mental health and reduce the kinds of symptoms that they were talking about, and can reduce potentially their bystander burden, right, to help us take care of the helpers. So some of the key takeaways for practice is that strengths is not just the absence of distress, that we assess strengths separately as protective factors, think in portfolios or toolkits rather than single traits, and that I think building on these modifiable strengths can be things that we do to promote. We can include these in more of our prevention programs, I think, than we've been doing to date. So we're going to get to theme 2. Kim, did we want to stop for a question or two? Deirdre, I don't know if you've caught anything in the chat about that, maybe 1 or 2 before you launch into the theme.
I don't see anything that has come through already, but if anyone wants to send something
Okay.
really quickly,
Great.
I'll flag it.
Okay. Awesome.
All right, so now we're going to move to our second theme, which is about early warning signs and early intervention. This section, again, is really grounded in the kind of questions you all submitted prior to today, how to recognize warning signs, how young people are involved in prevention, and how we can better support youth. And what we're seeing is that recognizing when something is wrong is actually one of the most critical and most challenging parts of the helping process. So, excuse me. So I'll start by sharing what we heard directly from youth about how they make sense of those early signs and where that process can break down. So from both interviews and survey data, there's a clear message that young people need more support identifying early warning signs. We found that about 1 in 10 didn't help because they didn't think the situation was serious, and a similar number said the person asked them not to tell. So even when opportunities to help are there, youth are often uncertain. And when someone says, don't tell, that can create a real dilemma for them, especially in close friendships, between respecting that request and also getting help. So the issue isn't just willingness to help, it's recognition and confidence. If youth don't see something as serious or don't know how to respond, helping may never even start. And even when youth do notice something might be wrong, the next barrier is, what do I actually do about it? So another major theme that we found in our data is that young people often feel unprepared. They told us they don't always know how to start conversations, what to say, how direct to be, or how to avoid making things worse. And then they also struggle with recognizing urgency. What's serious enough to act on right away versus something that they should really just be keeping an eye on. And many described not really understanding suicide risk or what steps to take if they are concerned. And importantly, this becomes even harder in online or long distance situations where cues are limited and it's harder to gauge how someone is really doing. So what we're seeing is that even when youth care and want to help, which is often, they often feel like they're guessing their way through some really high stakes situations. So what does this mean for prevention? First, we really need to think about skills, not just awareness. Young people are already paying attention and trying to help, but what they're missing is how to respond. And that includes how to start conversations, how to listen effectively, and how to recognize when something is urgent. Second, we need to take online environments seriously. For many youth, that's where warning signs show up through posts, messages, or ongoing engagement with different risky content online. That's not separate from their lives in this day and age. It is where a lot of the helping often begins. Third, youth were very clear about wanting to be part of the solution. They emphasized co-design, making sure prevention efforts actually reflect what they experience day to day, rather than what we assume they need. And finally, this isn't just about teaching youth to help. It's about creating systems around them so they're not carrying that responsibility alone. So before we move further, I just want to step back a little bit and think about where youth are actually getting suicide prevention messages. Almost all the young people in our study had been exposed to some form of suicide prevention in their lifetime. And that exposure came from a range of places: presentations, conversations with friends and family, and very commonly things they encountered online, especially social media. But what's really striking is that the formal programs are actually the least common way youth said they were getting this information. So even though we often focus on school or program-based prevention, most of what youth are learning is happening much more in a much more informal way and in everyday spaces. And that has important implications because those spaces aren't always structured, accurate, or supported. We also saw some important differences in how youth are accessing prevention information. Sexual and gender diverse youth in particular were more likely to seek out information online, highlighting how critical digital spaces are for reaching some groups. And more broadly, exposure does seem to matter. So youth who had exposure to suicide prevention, whether it was formal or informal, were more likely to know about resources like crisis lines and more likely to identify a supportive adult they could turn to. So access is doing something. It's increasing awareness and connection points, but it's not the whole story. And as we've been talking about, even when youth have exposure and awareness, they may still struggle with recognizing the warning signs or knowing how to respond in the moment. So the challenge isn't just reaching youth, it's making sure what they're getting actually prepares them to act. So even with all that exposure, there are still some important gaps to recognize. Young people told us they want more, especially when it comes to recognizing warning signs, knowing where to find resources, and most importantly, how to actually help someone in the moment. And one finding we want to be careful with, but take seriously, is that exposure to prevention was actually linked to a lower likelihood of intending to help a peer. That doesn't mean prevention isn't working, but it may suggest that some approaches are emphasizing referral to adults without building young people's confidence in their own role. So the takeaway is that prevention can't stop at awareness. We need to build practical, real-world helping skills, how to talk, how to listen, how to respond. And we also need to bring programs to where youth actually are: schools, peer networks, and especially the spaces, particularly online spaces that they're already at. And youth themselves pointed to the importance of peer-led approaches because in many cases, they're actually the ones who see the warning signs first. So ultimately, the goal isn't just to inform youth, it's to equip them with the skills they need. And if Deirdre has any questions about
We
that?
have one question
Mhm.
from Liz that either you or Vicky can answer. And this is from Liz. So if a student comes to tell the helping professional that they're having suicidal ideation or a friend is having ideation, but please don't tell anyone, we have to get them the appropriate support, which can potentially ruin their relationship with us, not trusting us in the future. What are some tips to help us repair that broken trust when they return to school?
So Kim, do you mind if I jump in
Yeah, go. I was gonna,
on
yeah, go
that?
for it. Yeah,
It's a great question. Thank you,
yeah.
Liz, for posting that. And I think some of the answers come in our interviews, both with young people, but also with practitioners. I think some of this is about the prevention and the having these conversations early and often. So that I think a lot of times, some of our young adult interviews where they had the kind of best experience with this was when there had already been conversations, both with peers and friend groups, and also with those askable or trusted adults. So that it wasn't just, oh, I need to tell this person I'm not sure what to do. And then all of a sudden, the situation is out of their control, which of course it kind of needs to be, because as you said, like, you have a responsibility to put supports in place. But I think that what young people were saying they wanted was beforehand, before it ever gets to that point where they're worried about someone, if they can be building that trust through those conversations with those trusted adults and understanding more about what will happen, so that, okay, if I tell you and you're going to get supports, this is what this is going to look like. And so It's really building more of that basis and foundation and talking through what it might look like if this happens in the future, hypothetically, right? And so I think that becomes an issue. And that's also true if you can get peers talking to peers. So they also can say, you know, if I'm really worried about you, I may not, and you tell me to keep it private, I may choose not to do that because I'm worried about you. And so, you know, I think, and people have some great stuff in the chat about talking about it early, about, right, because talking about suicide doesn't make a person more likely, it actually decreases it if we follow the research. It turns out, so in terms of the finding about bystander burden, that's, I think they're different lanes. So I think talking about suicide and asking people reduces the risk of the person who is at risk, right? And so we know this is super important. We also know it's important for building up that trust with the askable adult. But separately, what we're finding is the burden is about helping. So I think the piece, and Kim, maybe you want to say a little bit more about this, about how do we take care of the helpers, of the peers who are trying to help others. So this is from Essence. So I'm wondering, Kim, if you want to say a little more about that.
I actually have a theme 4 is all about that.
Okay.
So we can, why don't we pause that and then take that question after?
Okay. Great. Excellent. And I wonder if I'm also sensitive to, there's great stuff happening in the chat. I do resonate with, I can't remember who you are, who said this, but the fire hose of information. So I wonder, Deirdre, if we want to just post a few of the other polls that we did that people answered, so we can just take a pause, everyone can breathe,
Sure.
we can see who's in the room, and then we'll start with theme 3, just to kind of reduce the fire hose just a smidge.
Yeah. So the poll results should be shared, so everyone should be able to see those 3 questions now.
So
So
for some
I
reason,
think
I'm
you,
just seeing the primary
oh, I
one.
think we just have to scroll down, right?
Scroll,
So primary
yes.
Oh,
settings,
got
we
it.
have
Got
a
it.
lot of folks in schools, but also
Okay.
mental health centers, nonprofits. And we have about 40% who've delivered like a gatekeeper training. I know some people in the chat were talking about teen mental health first aid, lifelines, QPR, sources of strength, but also a fair number of people who haven't done that. So we've got a lot of different things. Oh, okay, peer-led club. Abby, thank you. Bring change to mind. Give youth the resources to end the stigma around mental health, mental illness. That's great. Abby Johnson's put some links in the chat for folks if they want to scroll through. Yeah, but also Isabella, thank you for also pointing some of the challenges to doing this work in schools and communities, because it is still a difficult topic for a lot of people. And so I think that's, yeah, for sure. And
Yeah, and
how do
also
we,
good news that these slides are all gonna be shared with you. So it'll give you some time after to kind of look at them in a little more detail and
Kim, they are in the chat as well,
oh,
the
great.
slides.
great.
Okay.
Thank you, Maureen. Awesome.
Great.
And the video, I think that this is being recorded also, Maureen, is that true?
Yes, and I put the link in. It will be posted on our website in a couple of days.
Awesome. And we'll say at the end, like, we love to hear from people. So you'll have our website where we'll be posting lots of
Mhm.
stuff, and also give you our emails, because we always love to hear from folks and figure out how to make our work more useful. So great. Awesome. Okay, so theme 3, now we're getting into the thick of some of these questions that I think you all are bringing up with the programs you're doing in your schools, or with some of the challenges, like how can peer-to-peer kind of maybe create some momentum, even if it's not really allowed in school. Maybe there are some creative ways in the community where peers can get together to do this and use some of the programming. I know some really amazing colleagues who are doing some violence prevention work in libraries. So anyway, go figure. I love libraries. So, but theme 3, what is the role of peers in suicide prevention? And really, this is what we're trying to dive into, listening to the voices of young people in our survey. So the first is just questions about who helps and how much helping are they doing? And I think that what you can see in the bar chart is sort of the average number of different types of helping actions that our participants reported taking for incidents in these different categories: NSSI, suicide ideation, suicide attempt. And you can see that they're not just doing one thing, they're doing a ton of things. On the right-hand side, you can see that most of the youth who said they were exposed are saying they tried to do something to help. The range of helping behaviors ranged from 0 to 33, with again these averages being more in the 13 to 14 to 15 types of helping per incident. So this really enforces that youth are very actively engaged. They're already doing this work in many different ways. And so we need to be connecting with them where they are in this work that they're doing. So what are helpers like? So one of the first set of analyses that we did was try to compare among those who reported that they were exposed, meaning they had opportunity potentially to help. We tried to compare those who said they did at least one thing to those who did not do any. And what we find is kind of similar to what we find in other bystander literature, but the young people who are most likely to help have more adversity and discrimination in their background. They're more likely to identify with social identity groups that experience minority stress and discrimination. They are young people who also report higher strengths related to compassion and confidence as helpers. They are young people who are already having proactive conversations. So many of these folks, to your point, Isabella, like a lot of these peers are already talking among themselves and kind of organizing themselves, at least within their social networks. They also had more knowledge about suicide thoughts and behaviors, and lower stigma overall about help seeking. So those kinds of things seem to be levers that are differentiating between those people who are likely to try to help and those who aren't. What does helping look like? So this came from our pilot study and then our expanded measures that we used to try to capture youth experiences in this study. And we had 33 different helping behaviors that we asked about in the survey that came from our pilot work. And then we also had an open-ended question, which was, and is there anything else you did that we didn't ask about? And there's lots and lots of those items as well, lots of those actions as well. But we really grouped them into 4 buckets, and 3 of them you'll recognize because we just talked about them a few slides ago in the resilience portfolio model. And then the 4th one was really a risk reduction category, which is really about trying to keep the person safe. Some of them talked about trying to remove lethal means. Some of them talked about trying to connect to a professional helper. So those kind of very in the crisis moment, very active risk reduction kinds of strategies. But then the other things that young people described doing really focused more on building strengths in their peers who they're worried about. And they really fall into 3 of the domains of the resilience portfolio model: regulatory, interpersonal, and meaning making. And you can see some of the examples here, like really listened and tried to comfort them, told the person they matter, expressed worry and concern, reminded the person they are not alone, asked them what they needed, checked in on the person, kept them company. That is something that comes up over and over again in the open-ended questions. Providing a distraction. A lot of young people talked about, oh my gosh, we tried to get them out of the house, we tried to do fun things, we tried to play video games with them, all of those kinds of things. Sharing their own lived experience, giving encouragement. All of these kinds of things are part of the helping portfolios that these young people are doing. And here's just a quote, because again, I feel like it's the voices of young people that drive this work and that are so inspiring. This person talked about staying on the phone or being physically present for however long they needed, and used my persuasion to convince them they mattered and that their pain was only temporary and others would be really hurt by it, and that she had plenty of people that truly loved her. So they're just trying to do a lot of things. And I think we still are trying to learn what are the most helpful things that they can do. But these are nonetheless describe what they're trying to do. We did then also ask them after they answered, did you do any of these 33 things? We then said, okay, which of these things that you checked off did you find the most helpful? And I think that was what was really interesting was that some of the highest levels, particularly were around risk reduction and interpersonal helping. But across the board, they're doing all of these things. And the blue bars represent our participants who did not self-report their own history of suicide attempt. And in pink are some of our participants who said that they did have their own lived experience and suicidality in the past. And you can also see that there are some really big differences between our participants in terms of what they felt was helpful if they had their own experience of suicide attempt or not. And so this is sort of another understanding of the helpers. That lived experience of a variety of sorts has a really big impact on what people think is helpful, and that especially those with their own history are reporting that interpersonal, listening and being there for the person and showing support and encouragement they were seeing were things that were really helpful. And what I think is also encouraging is the meaning making strengths, like showing people that they matter and trying to help engage them in purposeful activities and things were also endorsed by a lot of our participants as well. So just gives you a sense of what young people think is the most helpful. We also have been really exploring what happens after helping. And I think one of the most important findings of Project Lift Up, and we're really only in the very, very early stages of this, is understanding, because we have longitudinal data, is understanding what happens over time. And what we find is that across incidents is that if the person gets a negative reaction from the person they're trying to help, that really decreases their future helping. But they're probably willing to try again. But after a second negative reaction, their likeliness of helping again goes to almost zero. In the same way, we measured some things about how they felt themselves, their own level of distress or positive emotion about helping. If they feel really distressed and have really negative emotions about their helping, that decreases helping over time, and that we're looking at how positive reactions can potentially restore that helping. So this is a piece that I think we have to really puzzle about in our trainings, about whatever form of training you're doing. Is I think my experience in a lot of bystander intervention programs is that there's sort of this assumption that helping is good and it's going to go well. And what we're finding is that it's a real mixed bag and it's complicated, and that the problem is, if they get these negative reactions or feel really distressed in this process, it may really inhibit future helping. And so how can we support peers? How can we support these bystanders to try to have those more positive reactions? I think that goes back a little bit to what we were talking about before in terms of having these conversations early and often, so that if friends are talking to each other about, there's going to be a point, there may be a point where I'm so worried about you that I'm going to call in professional helpers. And let's talk about how you might feel about that. Let's talk about what that might look like. Because I think that can then, it's not going to make it all go away, right? Because every situation is difficult and unique, but I think it can help prime. I think it also, so actually in the next slide, we talk about some of these recommendations, that we treat helping as a process. It's not just one moment, that we prepare young people for mixed or negative reactions. And I think that some of that can happen if we are training groups of students in friend groups, in those naturally occurring social network groups, because I think that can, get them to sort of check in with each other. Well, how might you feel if I did this? Supporting the helpers, not just those at risk. Using peer messaging and messengers, use co-design, which I know a lot of people on this call already do, and building skills for those ongoing conversations. And that this isn't going to be a one point in time, but probably a multi-time point endeavor. And so really those ongoing conversations in peer networks are so important. We did also ask about where bystanders go for help because this is a really big thing, right? Which is not to try to help alone. And so the young people in our study, here you are, you all know this, right? Just kind of confirms what you know. That is part of the science, right? I work with a lot of practitioners, so I was like, oh yeah, thanks, we kind of already knew that. But okay, good to confirm it. 70% said they go to peers, right? So if they're feeling confused, they're seeking help themselves for helping, they go to their peers. 40% said family, and about a third said they went to some kind of professional. So and what are they asking for? Because we asked them specifically when you were in this situation, right? What did you try to get help with? How to help the person. So by far the majority responses tried to figure out how to help the person. 40% how to cope themselves, right? So these are the topics that our trusted adults need to be ready to have conversations about. And then 40% whether and how to take action, right? So helping others also creates their own need for support. And so I think that's also the piece about, is it okay to go and get help for yourself as a helper, right? And how do we message that? So this is just a quote from one of our young adult interviewees, because again, I'm a qualitative researcher and I just feel like participants say it better than I ever could. So, but I think I just really needed to share it with somebody. I did not want to be the only person carrying that, knowing when to connect and refer out. And so I went to somebody I considered an older sister because she was the person that had really helped pull me out of my bottom, like rock bottom when I was there. So I went to her and I asked her what she thought I should do. And she was like, I know this is not going to be what you want to hear, but I think you should. I think you should go to a counselor. So I think reinforcement in the decision really helped. People reinforcing the idea that I did actually need to tell an adult. And I did actually need to just people reinforcing that I did not have to be the only person to carry that was really helpful. So I think that's just really the power of that, permission and support to share that responsibility. The person knew something was wrong. They were trying to help, but what made the difference was someone else saying, you can get help and you can share that responsibility. And then I think what goes along with that is having some trust that's been built through previous conversations. Again, that's in this quote, this person had had a previous experience with this older person who had come through for them. And so they were able to go to them in this moment of ambivalence. And so I think there's some powerful lessons from young people in these words.
Okay. Deirdre, are there any questions?
We had one question from Essence. I replied to it, and this was after the helping behaviors slide, and she was wondering if these are young people who were self-motivated to help, or were they part of a program? And I replied and said, these data are from all the participants in our study, so not necessarily those in a program, though it's possible that some of them have had exposure to training or programs.
Right. I think it was about 9% though of our sample who had actually taken part in an official structured program. So a much smaller percentage.
Can I just say one shout out? So Erin, you said you're the program designer for Hope Squad. We cite Hope Squad all the time in our papers. So nice to meet you, Erin. Maybe we can connect offline. And everyone else who's training in teen mental health and QPR, and we're citing those programs all the time. So super cool. Anyway, sorry.
Great. All right. So we have one more theme for you for today. So far, we've talked about what young people are experiencing and how helping actually unfolds in real situations. But now we want to shift to a critical question, which is how do we support both young people at risk and the peers who are trying to help them? Because what we're seeing in the data, as you've heard, is that those are connected, but not exactly the same. So youth at risk need access to care, trusted adults, and systems of support. But the peers around them, the ones that are noticing the warning signs and starting conversations and staying engaged, they also need the guidance, skills, and support to do that safely and effectively. And as we just heard, Peers are often on the front line of prevention. So the question becomes, how do we strengthen those peer networks without placing too much responsibility on young people themselves? And I want to start by sharing a quote, which is the perspective from a practitioner, because this really captures what's at stake. And like taking that space and setting up that room for yourself to make sure you're okay. Because it's like, it's that classic conundrum of the first responder being in crisis from other people's crises. We don't want to create another patient. So what you hear there is a really important shift from just supporting the person at risk to also protecting and supporting the person who's trying to help. Because if we're not careful, we can unintentionally create a situation where the helper becomes overwhelmed also. And our data is really shifting how we think about helping. So instead of a single decision, did they help or not? Now, what we see is that helping is actually a process that unfolds over time, as Vicki was talking about.
You
Young
know
people.
how I,
Oh, go ahead. Oh, was there a question?
excuse me.
That's okay. Young people often try multiple things, not just once, but repeatedly. They might check in, give advice, step in directly, bring in others, and they adjust based on how the situation evolves. And that process looks very different depending on the context. So in some cases, helping is brief, but in many of the situations we're talking about, especially around trauma or loss, it's ongoing, really complex and uncertain. So what really matters isn't just whether a young person helped, it's how they helped and how long they stayed engaged and what they tried along the way. And that means we really need to move beyond simply encouraging helping to actually supporting young people in navigating that process. And helping isn't random. Our data is showing that it escalates in exactly the situations where things are hardest. So in close relationships, when somebody's struggling for a long time, and there are other multiple overlapping problems and concerns this person is struggling with. So what we're seeing is that when youth care deeply about someone, like a close friend, a family member, or a partner, they don't just try once, they keep trying. They use more strategies when they're close to someone, and each additional strategy increases the likelihood that they persist in helping. And that persistence also shows up in ongoing situations. So when something isn't resolved quickly, like chronic stress, violence exposure, or grief that unfolds over time, those aren't one-time moments, and youth do seem to recognize that. And when situations are more complex, when there are multiple problems happening at once, we actually see more helping effort, not less. So young people aren't avoiding the complexity. They're really stepping up and trying to help out. For those of you working with youth around traumatic loss, this may resonate. Young people often stay engaged with peers who are grieving or struggling, even when they don't feel fully equipped to handle that. So the takeaway here is that youth are already showing persistence in the hardest situations, but they're often doing it without enough support, guidance, or tools. And one of the most surprising findings is that more helping doesn't necessarily mean more effectiveness. This is another analysis we've just started looking into with our longitudinal data, and it's really interesting. We find that early on, helping tends to feel more effective. Youth feel like they're making a difference, and sometimes they are. And those first responses really do matter. But what we see over time, and Vicki alluded to this earlier, is that many young people keep trying. They use multiple strategies, they stay engaged, but they often don't feel like it's working. And that's especially true in the kinds of situations we're talking about here, grief, trauma, ongoing crises, where there isn't a quick fix. So as helping continues, two things start to happen. The sense of effectiveness can drop, and the effort required keeps increasing. And over time, we also see risk of overextension. So youth taking on more than they can realistically carry, especially when they feel responsible for someone that they care about. So the takeaway isn't that helping is a problem, it's that persistence without support can become a burden. And that's where adult guidance and structure really do matter. One of the key implications from this work is that we're really good at training effort, but not necessarily effectiveness. We're good at telling young people to step in, to do more, to refer to adults, But what we hear from youth themselves is that many don't want to refer out right away. They see it as their role as a friend to try to help first. And they also worry about what happens if they do refer out. Again, we were talking about this earlier, whether it will escalate the situation or break trust. And at the same time, practitioners point out that even when we tell youth to go to a trusted adult, we don't always ensure those adults are actually prepared to respond. And we also know there's a gap between saying you have a trusted adult and actually being willing to go to that person in a real moment. So we're much less good at what we're much less good at is helping youth understand when is what I'm doing working and when is it time to do something different. And we have one practitioner quote that put it this way: maybe some creative ideas as more than just like, if you know a friend who's at risk of harming themselves, tell someone about it. But like, how do I tell someone about it? What do I say? So the gap isn't just action, it's guidance. And that's where our prevention efforts really need to evolve. Here's a quote from a young adult participant that really gets at something deeper than just helping. It's about how young people understand their role in these situations. So I'm just going to read this in full because it captures that experience really clearly. This young person said, "I don't think it always goes away. Like, I don't think just because you deal with it at that age and at that point, it really entirely goes away. I think things like this are things that people need to keep coming to terms with across their life, like through their lifetimes. I think knowing that would have actually really helped me at that point because I would have realized that I could not solve her problem. And there was nothing to solve, right? Like she was not something to fix. And I never really saw her as that. But I really thought that like if I tried hard enough, if I tried to be the person there for her hard enough, she would stop. And it would like the impulse would stop and she would never feel this again. But again, I just don't think that those things are unfortunately true. Would I have wanted her to know that? Absolutely not. Do I think that would have helped me to know as somebody trying to be there for her? Yeah, absolutely. I did not have to be the one and only resource that she had for a lifetime. So what you're hearing here is something we saw again and again. Young people often do go into these situations believing if I try hard enough, I can fix this. And that belief drives a lot of persistence. But eventually, many do come to a really difficult realization that this isn't something they can solve on their own. And without support, that shift can be really hard for them. It can feel like failure rather than understanding the limits of what one person can do. So what this participant is really naming is the need to help young people see that they don't have to be the only source of support. And from the practitioner perspective, there's a really clear model of how helping is supposed to work. Young people are seen as inevitable gatekeepers. They're the ones who notice first, who are closest, who are most likely to be there in the moment. But the focus is really on managing burden and risk. So the goal becomes how young people recognize a problem, connect that person to resources, and then hand things off to trusted adults or systems. And there's a strong emphasis on making sure those systems are ready, of course, having askable adults and clear pathways for what to do next. So in this model, young people are important, but they're positioned as connectors, not the ones expected to carry the situation forward necessarily. And that makes a lot of sense from a safety perspective, but it doesn't always fully match what we hear from the youth about how helping actually unfolds for them. So, for example, when we listen to young people, we hear something quite different. They don't see themselves as just connectors. They see themselves as active, intentional interveners. Helping for them is not a one-time action. It's ongoing, it's relational, and often persistent, especially when it involves someone they care about. It's shaped by closeness, by lived experience, and by a strong sense of responsibility. And even when they do seek support from others, they don't feel like they can just step away. So while systems are designed around handoffs, young people experience helping as staying involved. For them, helping doesn't end when they tell someone, it continues. That's really important to think about. And this is where we see a really important gap. Our systems are built around a model of step in, hand off, step back. But what young people actually experience is something very different. Stay, try more, and keep showing up. So we're essentially asking young people to do the hardest part of helping to stay engaged in complex, ongoing situations without always giving them clear guidance on when to step back, how to set boundaries, and how to share that responsibility. And that gap helps explain what we see in the data, that why helping becomes persistent, effortful, and over time can start to feel ineffective. So the question isn't just about how we get young people to help, it's how we support them so they don't have to carry it alone. And that is the end of all the data and information.
which is a lot.
It is a lot, yes. So I
And
don't,
just want
Deirdre,
to
if you
shout out somebody talking also about Sources of Strength, another program that we cite a lot in
Yeah.
our work because it does really focus a lot on connecting to trusted adults. And there's some really good conversation happening in the chat about parents. Maybe we'll have some of that in the Q&A where people want to share about how to get parents involved. Do they have concerns? And I think, this is the piece about training the askable or trusted adults in sexual assault prevention. I was involved with a nonprofit that had their youth, so they had a sexual assault prevention program, another area where parents get agitated. I'm a parent of 3 children, so I get it. But the young people actually designed a 4-hour adult family workshop around dating violence and healthy relationships and all this kind of stuff. And I know some of the programs you all are talking about in the chat also do that in relationship to suicide prevention. So I think that's just, again, those early and often conversations. So we now want to open it up because we love to do the science because we believe in our hearts that it can affect prevention and help the incredibly important work that all of you are doing with young people. And so this is the part where we say, hopefully this is helpful. So what questions do you have? What questions could this project answer for you? We are always open to people emailing us. If you have a presentation you want for your organization, or if you have questions that our data might be able to answer for your work, reach out to us. We are doing some re-interviews of practitioners, but we may have some room for a few new practitioner interviews. So if anyone's interested in being interviewed to actually be part of the study to tell us what you think about the findings, reach out to us. So this is kind of where we are in to see if there are more questions, and then we'll just show you our website and give you our details so you can be in touch. And I know Maureen also has some details from the Traumatic Loss Coalition too. So questions, Deirdre, do you see open
Yes,
to
we
come and speak?
have
Yeah, we'll go
we have an
anywhere.
interesting one from John Bosco, and this is on given the focus on peer-led suicide prevention, I'm curious about the potential for peers who are trained in these initiatives to be supported and encouraged to pursue careers in clinical psychology or counseling psychology. Are there examples or strategies for how peer leaders can be nurtured towards these career paths, ultimately strengthening the mental health workforce? Very interesting question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Vicki. Yeah.
So John, that's a great question. And actually, we have the answer to it in our interviews. So we have 25 young adult interviews. They were pulled from our survey respondents, and many of them have sought extra training. So a number of them are currently waiting to go to grad school, and they're working on the 988 hotline or other crisis services. Some of them were graduate students or already applying or in graduate school for clinical psychology. But I think you're right. I think that there is so much more that we could do in the prevention space with young people. I mean, I've worked in middle schools and high schools and on college campuses, and I think we don't always make that link between the skills they're learning in our prevention program and how that could also lead to workforce readiness and careers. I think it's really cool to think about from a strengths-based perspective how you could add some of that in, because we all know that we need to build the behavioral health and prevention workforce for sure. And Patricia is an example. Peer leader in high school, eventually became a school counselor. Excellent. Love it.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I would say too, we do see there is a really great portion of our participants that are really activists, and you know, they seem to me like they could be that, you know, just ideal like peer leaders and you know, moving on and kind of a group to support in kind of future work in this area.
No other questions waiting in the chat, so we can keep it open. Oh, we have one. Where'd it go? Joe, is there a downside to training youth without training the adults around them?
Kim, you want to take that first? Sure.
Oh, sorry, I was reading the next comment about the ethnic
Oh,
breakdown.
do you want to turn up the slide about the race ethnicity of the sample and I'll try to answer the
Yeah.
training question?
Yes.
Because we can go back in the slide. So Joe, I mean, I think that's the piece that we're
Right,
talking
not in
about with
here.
the bystander burden, right? So I
Right.
think that that what we're seeing is that we want to just be careful about just acknowledging it, right? So that we and preparing them for it, and also that piece about helping them put boundaries around some of that persistence and some of those expectations, right? Like we're talking about an age group, again, you all know this better than I, where friends and social network members are so important, right? Like for so many things, for strengths and protective factors, as well as for risk factors and social norms and all that stuff. And so I think that, we want to be thinking about that and preparing them for that, right? So acknowledging, not just saying just pass it off, but yes, we know you want to stay engaged. These are friends that you're going to have for a long time, but let's also talk about the cost for you. And I think there was one point in one of the practitioner interviews where I was talking with someone and they stopped in the interview and they said, you know, this is really making me think that when I'm working with young people, I spend so much time asking them about their own suicide thoughts and behaviors, and I don't ever ask them, are there people you're worried about? And how's that going for you? How are you feeling about that worry? And what are you doing about it? And so I think there are also some assessments in different places that you know that can help mitigate some of that, because I think the agency and the compassion and the energy of young people in these helping roles is really inspiring, but we need to make sure that they're not burning themselves out, because that also relates to the workforce question, right? Like if we burn them out in high school, then they're definitely going to go in the other direction of doing this work.
Yeah. And then just the question about the race and ethnicity, it accidentally got left off that slide, but it was a pretty diverse sample. We made sure of that. We have, I think, 37% identified as race and ethnic minority groups. And we're starting to look at that. We have some colleagues who are doing a deep dive into some of those subgroups of youth in our study. I saw a comment about vicarious trauma. There's a great literature out there on that. Most of it is with professionals, though. I was actually just trying to find some citations for a paper around vicarious trauma specific to youth, and there's not much out there, but I think absolutely that's something we should be thinking about in the context of this.
Yeah. And I posted a screen grab from our website of the race ethnicity breakdown, and
Oh,
also,
thank you, Deirdre.
yeah, the link to our website, which on the methodology page has all of that, all the demographic breakdown, locations of where participants were. So yeah, definitely check that out. We have another question/comment on hotlines training teen volunteers to take calls with other teens, which is super interesting. The Youth Line, Teen Line, Teen Lifeline. They're wondering about the efficacy of these programs and the impact this work has on those volunteers, and how might our project connect with that.
Mm. Interesting. I
I mean,
mean,
I think there's a need for that. I mean, our research team has a grant proposal some colleagues we're collaborating with to look at those who staff 988, and to look at some of their protective factors and some of that stuff, but not specifically related to these teen lines and things.
mm,
I think it's a really good question. The person who's on here about the Hope Squad, I do know that some of the Hope Squad findings do look at that burden question and do find that the training, for example, doesn't increase. I forget what the exact variable was, but it's something I cite about Hope Squad that, it doesn't create kind of some of these iatrogenic effects. But I think that's an area that we really need to study more, and that we also need to study. This goes back to the strengths piece, right? We don't want to just look at risk and burden in isolation, because some of these strengths and positive feedbacks and things like that, our resilience portfolios can mitigate some of that. So I think we need to be looking at more of that things. And there's Erin talks about this. Yes, and
mhm.
it's talking about parents. So there's some questions about parents as well and how to involve them. That is happening in the chat. Thanks for responding. This is the best part thanks Deirdre for elevating that and putting it back forward. But so anyway, I think but to your point about the efficacy, again, I don't know that we have the data on that, but in other prevention realms, which again, I understand is a different topic, but has some overlap. When there's people who've done research on prevention of risky health behaviors, including substance use and things like that, and their data seems to show that training peers to talk about prevention in their social networks is very uh, impactful and can work better than having adults if they're trained and they have support. Now that's different from working a crisis line, right? Like the crisis line is another kind of next level. But I think what we're seeing in our data is that youth are already doing a lot of this and they're kind of up for it. And they just we need to give them support so that they're not burning out by doing
Mhm.
this and having, appropriate boundaries and things like that. So,
And that maybe just think too, we don't talk much about parents supporting parents. Like I've had experiences because people know I work in this field of, friends that are concerned about their own kids and what should they do. And I think that's also just something, we're talking about families and parents and something to include in that conversation and what we're thinking about helping them with.
yeah, yeah. And what we found in the focus groups that we did, so again, drawing from a different lane, which I'm not trying to equate at all, because I do think that there are really unique differences, even though I'm arguing for de-siloing prevention, because ultimately I do think that's the best idea. But when I was working around sexual assault prevention and healthy relationship prevention and working in communities, the nonprofit I worked with was working in New York City across communities, some of whom have really very specific social norms against dating and around, initiation of intimate relationships in adolescence. And so tricky questions about healthy relationships and sexual behavior. And when these young people did the 4-hour training with the adults, the focus groups afterwards that we did, they weren't all parents, but they just really talked about how powerful it was to hear from young people, like
Mm,
how powerful it was to hear and to be taught by them to say, listen, this is important to us. And this may be how it was when you were growing up, but this is how it is for us. And it was this structured way where the script was flipped because it was the young people teaching the adults and just the powerful transformation that these adults talked about. And I think people are talking about that in the chat about finding ways to engage parents in those conversations. And some of it can just be about healthy communication, right? You lead with strengths and then you get into the difficult topics about, okay, once you start listening, then you might hear some stuff that then you
mhm.
have to figure out how you're going to hear that. But I think the more that we can do that, I mean, I know again, my kids are all just kind of getting into adulthood right now. But I remember getting a flyer home from school. My kids were in middle school, and I was really glad to see that a mental health project was happening and they were alerting us through an email that suicide was going to be talked about.
Mhm.
That was it. We got no discussion questions. We got no, here's what you might ask your student when they come home. Here's what the content was. So if they start talking to you, you can ask them questions about it. It was just nothing. And so it was like,
Mm.
okay, well, I know my kid has been talking about this really intensive topic, but like if I didn't have any training, like, and even if I do, they're my kids, like all of a sudden all the training goes out the window when it's your kid who's talking about this stuff.
Mhm.
So I think there are lots of ways to have those conversations, including starting with strengths, which is at the core of what so many of you are doing in these programs you're talking about, that can engage those significant adults and get their guard down a little bit so they're willing to talk to you. And I've seen it happen across different topics. I've been in front of school boards, like talking to angry parents who think that we're doing a sex survey or whatever. And once you can talk about strengths, and then once you get the voices of young people in there saying this is what we need, all the bets are off, right?
We have another question from Aaron. What would you say to those in schools who hesitate to add in programs or teachings about suicide prevention because they aren't prepared to handle the response or referrals? I run across this a lot and would love to support those schools more effectively.
Mm. That's a great question. I mean, so much of it is, this speaks to this kind of broader community in that we really need to take a community approach. And it's so true that a lot of communities aren't ready for this. They don't have the resources. They don't have enough people that are able to help and respond to these kids. Um, I do think that I don't think that should necessarily mean that schools should not bring these programs and teach them. But I think maybe, and Vicki, let me know what you think about this, but maybe do that in a more meaningful way. So maybe there are some community members that do this. So do it in, if that's something they're concerned about, have those people in the room when you're, bringing these programs, someone there that the kids can talk to and ask questions to, and have some resources. There's a lot of resources that aren't necessarily local communities now, right? We see kids are going online a lot, and there are some amazing resources online for them. We just need to be able to help direct them to the appropriate ones, because obviously there's a lot of other stuff online. So, I think having this in school is really important, but yeah, kind of recognizing that being able to handle the response, once you open that kind of can of worms, is important. And it's just some ideas about some ways to do that. Right, rural communities.
So I don't see any other lingering questions. So I don't know if there's any lasting thoughts, any parting words.
Maureen, you had some things you wanted to go over with people?
Oh, thank you. So in the chat, you have seen the PowerPoint. So thank you for sharing that, Vicki, Kim, and Deirdre. Thank you for your help today as well. Also, a certificate. There's a link. So you will have a certificate just of attendance for today. So that's also in the chat. We're encouraging you to go to the website where this recording will be housed in a few days, but also too, if you see on the website, you'll see upcoming trainings. So we have Dr. Scott Poland coming down in South Jersey. Dr. Singer is going to be talking about AI and suicide prevention. Dr. Kim O'Brien talking about athletes and mental health. Dr. Jessica Hamilton is going to be talking about sleep and suicide. Dr. Horowitz will present again about the Ask tool. We'll be providing a QPR, hopefully train the trainer. So if you want to become a QPR trainer. So I just want to say thank you for joining us today. There were at one point like over 170 people on. Vicki and Kim, Deirdre, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thank you also for making that connection between research and implementation and making it a reality, because so many times things are researched, but then we that are not researchers are like, well, what do we do with that information?
Right.
So we really appreciate you taking that extra step besides of gathering this important data, but sharing it in a way that we can digest it and then say, oh, this is what we can do with it. So I'm so grateful. I'm grateful for the partnership and just want to encourage everyone to keep doing the work, because what the work that you're doing is so important. And sometimes it may not feel like we're saving lives, but we are. We are saving young lives and we're helping our young people. So keep up the good work. We're stronger together. And I always love to like connection is protection. So let's all stay connected. So Vicky, Kim, Deirdre, thank you so much. Laura and Doris, thanks for helping in the background. Everyone have a blessed day. Spring is here. It's here. So
Not in New
We
Hampshire
just
yet.
gotta keep saying that. Maybe not in New Hampshire. Yeah, and please reach out to us. Reach out to
Yeah.
us through the project. Visit our website. Email us. We love to collaborate with people. So we'll stay in touch.
yep. Be well, everyone.